Welcome to Creating Wealth with Jason Hartman. During this program, Jason is going to tell you some really exciting things that you probably haven't thought of before and a new slant on investing. Fresh new approaches to America's best investment that will enable you to create more wealth and happiness than you ever thought possible. Jason is a genuine self-made multimillionaire who not only talks the talk, but walks the walk. He's been a successful investor for 20 years and currently owns properties in 11 states and 17 cities. This program will help you follow in Jason's footsteps on the road to financial freedom. You really can do it. And now, here's your host, Jason Hartman, with the complete solution for real estate investors.
This is Jason Hartman. Today we're going to interview Thomas Sowell, the author of Basic Economics and many other books. We're talking to him today mostly about his latest book, The Housing Boom and Bust. And Thomas Sowell is a consummate academic. I used to read him in Forbes magazine years ago and really always liked what he had to say. He was very reasonable and logical and interesting and did a great interview for us.
One of the problems that's not been mentioned at all, I think, is that there are interest rate ceilings. Now, the lower the interest rate ceiling, the higher the credit rating of the people that you're going to lend to. I mean, if you bring this interest rate ceiling down low enough, you will lend only to millionaires. And if you bring it below that, you'll lend only to billionaires. So the very fact that there's a ceiling means that there'll be a disparate impact on people of different income levels. And if you're talking about low-income minorities, that virtually guarantees that there will be differences in loan approval rates under those conditions. I'm not saying that was the only reason. It was by no means the only reason. When you look at the borrowers, you discover that credit scores vary by group. That is, blacks and Hispanics don't have as high a credit scores on average as whites, and whites don't have as high an average credit score as Asian Americans. And in fact, what was fascinating to me was how the press, in pushing their case that this was a question of white racism causing blacks not to be approved as often, even though blacks, like whites, most of them were approved anyway. If you look at the very same data and the very same studies, you find whites weren't approved as often as Asian Americans. So now, since most of the loan people are white, you're going to tell me that they're discriminating against whites and in favor of Asian Americans. They're in the business of making money. And many of the very people who are forever talking about corporate greed don't seem to understand the implications of that. That is, if you're in business to make money, you're certainly not going to turn away people who are going to pay you back with interest.
You know, one of the radio show hosts that used to be here in the L.A. market, he was very popular, and he endorsed us on our radio advertising, our commercials. He was, reading our commercials a lot. And one of the things he said when I saw him speak once is he said, can you imagine the conversation that would happen when people accuse companies of discrimination? Some executive is sitting at the breakfast table who runs a huge company talking to their spouse, and their spouse is saying, let's get a bigger, better, nicer home. And the executive would be thinking, well, gee, I don't want to sell to people of a certain race. Can you imagine they would turn down money? I mean,
they never have.
Yeah.
And moreover, this is not a question of person at the bank or the lending agency is probably going to see this applicant one time.
Right. Or maybe they never see them at all. I mean,
that's right. That in many cases you don't even see them.
Right.
Because you do it over the phone, and their contact with them in future will just be checks arriving in the mail. And the idea that this guy is going to be sitting and saying, "Oh, I know this guy is black, and I hate to see his check coming in this month."
Yeah.
I mean, yes. Well,
just on the face of it, it just doesn't make any sense because everybody goes for the green. Everybody likes the money. Well, besides the Community Reinvestment Act and other similar pressures, what else went on with the housing boom and bust? I mean, in your book, you break it up into the economics, the politics, and then some mystiques and housing mistakes. Tell us about that.
In addition to the pressures on the banks to lend, there was also the pressure on Fannie Mae to purchase mortgages from people of low to moderate income, as they put it, and in other ways consistent with the Community Reinvestment Act. And so the bank can then lend really to people, whatever race they might be, of low credit rating that they would never lend to if they were themselves going to collect this money. What the banks do in this case, they can make the mortgage, sell the mortgage to Fannie Mae, collect their money now on the 30-year loan, and let Fannie Mae worry about what's going to happen, whether these people will pay this thing off for 30 years. And so it was government-subsidized moral hazard. And Fannie Mae, of course, had the taxpayers to back them up. So risky mortgages carry higher interest rates. Fannie Mae has every incentive to buy these risky mortgages because if they make a profit, then Fannie Mae profits. And if they make a loss, again, they have the taxpayers to fall back on.
Yeah, and then they also have the printing press to fall back on, too, with the Federal Reserve, right?
Yes. Now, the politics of it was just unbelievable because all sorts of people, not only in the United States, but even overseas, The Economist magazine started warning some years ago that there are all these risky mortgages out there on American houses. People overseas were buying securities based on those mortgages, and the whole thing looked very shaky. So they did not lack for warnings. The head of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation warned them. Secretary of the Treasury Snow warned them. Alan Greenspan warned them about Fannie Mae. I even did a piece in the Wall Street Journal. I mean, it's joining the mob. I mean, you could just name barons, Fortune, all sorts of people warned them. And the answer was always the same, that to the extent that you emphasize safety, and they poo-pooed the danger, to the extent that you emphasize safety, you're going to reduce the ability of the banking system to make housing affordable. There was just no telling them anything until the whole thing burst.
Yeah, it was a big house of cards and moral hazard. And you know, this is the problem, Thomas, when government gets involved. It becomes a special interest nightmare. If the government just stays out of the way, all of these special interests and all of these people that have their own agendas that are contrary to really the public good in most cases, at least on the long-term public good, sometimes in the temporary, they slap a Band-Aid on problems, but they never really seem to cure them. They create dependency, they create animosity, they create class hatred. You know, it seems to me like when you're talking about this issue, we started off on of CRA and race and underserved populations and things. It seems to me that if the government really wanted to be neutral, they'd stop counting and stop asking. I've sort of always wondered why they even ask what race I am on the census form and on a loan application. I know on the loan application you don't have to answer it, but why do they even count this stuff?
Because there's political mileage in it.
Yeah.
One of the other aspects of government, here in this case would be state and local government, there was a very false premise, quite aside from the racial aspect. There was a fundamentally false premise behind this whole drive for creating more affordable housing. And that was that there was a national problem of unaffordable housing. It's just clear beyond words, and I cite all the sources and so forth in the book, The Housing Boom and Bust. But there was not a national problem of housing becoming unaffordable. What there were particular areas of the country, coastal California being the classic example, where housing was indeed enormously expensive. Average house in California sold for some multiple of the national average. I happen to live in one of the areas where at one time the San Mateo County, the average cost of a house during the boom reached over $1 million, and the average size of the house was less than 2,000 square feet. So
That's
we're not
crazy.
talking mansions.
Yeah, no, these are $500 a square foot. I mean, it got worse than that. High rises in Miami and Las Vegas at the peak were $1,000 a square foot. I mean, at least some people bought them. It was just crazy. It was so out of sync. And one of the things I always say to people is that in a country as large and diverse as the United States of America, there is no such thing as a national housing market.
Yes.
There are about 400 distinct markets, and they really are quite different, aren't they?
They are, and the places where housing was very expensive, for example, in California, there was many places where the average person taking out a new mortgage would pay one-half the family income just to put a roof over their head. Now, but those were very few places, and you can see that this is where the housing prices shot through the roof. This is where the housing profits fell down through the basement after the bust. I saw a statistic recently, something like I think it's 5 states where over 60%, or about 60%, of all the defaults occurred in 5 states. Mm-hmm. And I think if you looked at it more closely, you'd see that they occurred in particular areas within those 5 states. Mm-hmm. Even in California, there are some places further inland where housing prices are not astronomical. The government was determined that there was a national problem, and therefore they created this national program, which then created a very real problem that we're still living with.
So when you say they created the national program, to what are you referring? Fannie Mae?
I'm referring to the affordable housing schemes. The fact that banks were under pressure, so they had to submit those statistics that you mentioned about race, income, and all that kind of stuff, in order to get permission to do the ordinary things that businesses do, because they're a regulated industry.
Yeah. You know, Thomas, it just seems to me like the whole concept of Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac is acting contrary to its supposed goal, because if you think about it, it's the whole concept. I mean, it's right in Fannie Mae's mission statement. Their goal is to promote housing and home ownership. Well, by obvious result is that whenever you promote anything, it becomes more popular, and by the basic rule of economic supply and demand, it becomes more expensive, doesn't it?
It does, except in the case of housing, I think the Federal Reserve has gotten a little bit more blame than it should have, in the sense that they did create the expanded credit that allowed this to happen and promoted this happening. The fact is, when there's been in places where there's been an increased demand for housing, even when you double or triple the number of houses within, say, a decade or so, the housing prices do not rise if the suppliers are allowed to supply the housing. The key to the California situation is you have all these open space laws, historical preservation laws, farmland preservation laws, and they're not allowed to expand the housing. And so, therefore, the most modest increase in demand for housing will shoot the prices up through the roof. Right,
and that's the old concept of that riddle, you know, what do you call a developer? Someone who wants to build a house in the woods or at the beach. What do you call a environmentalist? Someone who already has a house in the woods or at the beach, right?
Oh, it really does send my blood pressure through the roof, because the prices are just out of all proportion. There's no reason why any family should have to pay half of their income just to have a house. If you look at the places in the country where the politicians have not intervened in the market, places like Dallas and Houston, those are the places where the housing is most affordable. In fact, there have been international studies showing the same thing, that you look at the most expensive housing markets around the world. In almost every case, it was because there are severe limitations on building. And when you cut back on the supply, fall in demand, then you're going to have prices shooting up.
So a couple great examples of that. First of all, I'm here in Orange County, California, which is completely overpriced, and it's a very unhealthy market. You know, we have something here called the Coastal Commission.
Oh, yeah.
The Coastal Commission is like the Gestapo. You cannot build anything on this coastline. It is, if you can see it from the ocean, you're on a boat on the ocean, and you want to build it, it is very, very difficult. And it really bugs the heck out of me, because here I pay for this enormous cost to live in this supposedly beautiful place, which, you know, it's beautiful in many ways, but there's no good restaurants on the ocean. We've got this gorgeous ocean out here, and you go down to Mexico, and there's all kinds of beautiful dining on the ocean. But here in Orange County, there's about 3 places where you can dine on the ocean. You know, I want to sit there and have a beer and a dinner and overlook the sea and the sunset. And you just can't do it. It's ridiculous.
I twice have gone to actual meetings of planning commissions, and I just wish that I'd been able to tape it, because it is like Alice in Wonderland. I mean, you find people there, members of the commission, saying things to the developer like, well, you know, this landscaping could be nicer. Of course it could be nicer. And after he's made it nicer, it could be nicer than that still. It's just that he's trying to build what people are willing to pay for. And, you know, it's easy to sit on the planning commission and want all kinds of things. I must say, I got so upset, I almost walked out to the back of the auditorium. And I said, no, I'm doing this for my research. I need to sit down and just suffer through it. And I did. But I certainly wish that this stuff had been taped.
You are so right about that. The hypocrisy is amazing. You've got all these armchair bureaucrats